what's up everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Spectator Sports. This is episode 50 and we're just celebrating our 1-year anniversary of Spectator Sports. Really loving what's happening so far. We started off with YouTube last year, slowly expanded to other platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify. All links are in the description, by the way. And really loving how it's been able to expand and grow. But do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the channel, makes us grow, helps us out so much. And also for my Spotify listeners, if you can give us a 5-star review, it helps us out there as well. But getting into the NBA, we are now totally wrapped up with the NBA regular season. We know the play-in tournament. We know a few of the playoff matchups, which we will preview later on in this episode. But I wanted to talk about the Dallas Mavericks. The Dallas Mavericks have missed out on the play-in tournament entirely. And you were thinking 2 months ago when they acquired Kyrie Irving, they were sitting at about the 4 seed, obviously thinking that they would be a lock to make the postseason, but you thought only the sky is the limit for this team, given that this could be the most talented backcourt in the NBA today. But it's not even on Kyrie, it's not even entirely on Luka Doncic, it's actually on the management of the Dallas Mavericks, and this starts obviously with Mark Cuban. He's the guy that has the entire franchise from start to bottom. And from him as a businessman, giving up all those assets like Dorian Finney-Smith, for example, their prime wing defender, and relying on these smaller guard lineup where you're having Tim Hardaway Jr. guarding these bigger small forwards like Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, for example, or even guys like Brandon Ingram who are just going to tower above a poor guy like Tim Hardaway Jr. And then the bigs are not that imposing. I mean, yeah, they were able to trade for Christian Wood, but he has been an okay big, not a lot of production or a game changer in terms of moving the needle for the big man play. They had Powell in there as well. I mean, he's solid, but they're not really able to get on the rebounds. I mean, they're getting destroyed on the glass, and that's just because they're a smaller team, and they're getting picked apart on the perimeter. I mean, their perimeter defense has been one of the worst since acquiring Kyrie Irving. Obviously, Luka out there has been a negative on defense. He has talked about how his play needs to certainly improve, and it does. He needs to work on fitness, being more available. He comes into the season a little bit overweight. Definitely doesn't seem to be the most athletic of players. That's obviously not his game. He's more of a technical, sound player like Nikola Jokic, but he has to find some way to contribute on the defensive end because, like I said, he's getting picked apart. Players are going right by him, and Kyrie is obviously not known to being a great defender either, but he is far more capable or a willing defender than Luka Doncic is. So a few things to help the Mavericks moving forward. I think one thing that they need to do is find a true big, a guy that can plug up the paint but also be available to stretch out on the perimeter, take some shots. And I thought Kristaps Porzingis was perfect for them. The problem is that Porzingis is just not healthy enough to be that consistent big man that Luka Doncic could need. But if he was healthy, I would have loved to see that pairing have more time together. And then, of course, they have to re-sign Kyrie Irving. Having him back is going to take a lot of pressure off of Luka Doncic, and then you have two guys that can create their own shots, and you can stagger the minutes out. That way, you can have somebody to run Jason Kidd's offense at all times on the court. Plus, adding in some key wing defenders like those classic 3-and-D players, somebody that can lock down guys on the perimeter but also contribute on shooting. That's going to be instrumental for the Mavericks to improve and build on that previous season in 2022 where they made it all the way to the Western Conference Finals. Obviously, with this tank job that they tried to do on Friday where facing elimination, you had Luka Doncic playing a quarter and a half and them benching the rest of their leading scorers like Tim Hardaway Jr., Kyrie Irving, for example. The Mavericks brass was probably thinking, okay, yeah, we could make the play-in tournament, but what good would that do? If we lose this game, lose the rest of our games, we improve our chances of getting a guy like Wemby and changing the franchise that way. Obviously, the chances are not going to improve drastically with the losing the last couple of games of our NBA regular season. The NBA has taken numerous steps to try and dismay tanking from recent years, and with this play-in tournament, that's a more incentive to try and engage in postseason play. Obviously, I don't think they're going to get a guy like Victor Wembanyama, but there could be consequences to pay for this attempted tank job, and definitely puts a guy like Jason Kidd under some scrutiny too, because he has to force to answer these questions to the press and media when it's clearly decisions from up top. It's going to be a very pivotal offseason for the Dallas Mavericks, because if they don't make any significant changes, I see Luka Doncic potentially asking for a trade out of Dallas in 2024. With the play-in bracket set, I wanted to give my picks and even preview a few of these matchups coming up this week leading up into the NBA postseason. To start, we have the Miami Heat taking on the Atlanta Hawks. These are two division rivals. They have a lot of familiarity with each other, actually playing in a postseason matchup with the 1-8 matchup last season. Miami has taken a big step back. Obviously, they've shown signs of age. They've had issues with health as well, and they're not the same team that finished atop the Eastern Conference last season. The Hawks have been an interesting team. They made the trade for DeJounte Murray, but they lost their head coach earlier this season and decided to tweak things around there. I'm not really sure if that's really changed anything or moved the needle per se, because they still finished in the play-in tournament just like they did last season. I think they have the better player in Trae Young. They have a pretty decent team around him too. The problem is, I think veteran coaching matters here. The Heat are a veteran team, and if you're picking a guy to deliver in a winner go home situation, it's going to be a guy like Jimmy Butler. I think the Heat will be able to pull off and hold on to the 7th seed, and that will force the Hawks to play the winner of the 9-10 matchup. And to talk about the 9-10 matchup, we have the Toronto Raptors taking on the Chicago Bulls. The Bulls obviously have been through a tumultuous year too. They've had some disappointing times. Obviously, some of that has come back from the Lonzo Ball injury. They've had issues also just being or creating the same magic that they had last season when they were a mid-tier Eastern Conference playoff team. I think this year it's certainly been difficult to adjust to that with injuries and players not being the same guys that they were last season. And with the Toronto Raptors, they also slightly took a step back last season as well. We're hearing rumblings already that Nick Nurse could potentially be coaching for his job. They might look to separate from him in the future. I'm not sure about that. Nick Nurse is a pretty good head coach, but I think in terms of execution of what he wants to do, hasn't been working out. Since last year, they had Scotty Barnes, who was the Rookie of the Year, and the Toronto Raptors have been trying to install a kind of a 5-forward type of lineup where they have a lot of guys who are long, lengthy guys who are trying to shoot, they just don't shoot that well. It's a nice concept, and it worked towards the tail end of last season, and we just haven't seen it been able to have that same type of success this season. I think the Raptors have enough to get by the Chicago Bulls, and that would set up a matchup between them and the Atlanta Hawks. I've seen the Hawks been able to beat the Raptors already twice this season, and I think they'll be able to handle business, especially at home. So I'll take the Atlanta Hawks to hold on to the 8th seed, and the Raptors will be going home. In the Western Conference, we have the LA Lakers taking on the Minnesota Timberwolves, and it's an interesting end to the regular season where the Lakers have been looking very strong. As of late, they've finished the regular season 8-2, and part of that is LeBron returning to the lineup after missing significant time due to a foot injury, and also just AD being far more available. He's been healthy and looking very, very good as the postseason is coming around. I think the biggest thing now is the matchup against the Minnesota Timberwolves. The Lakers will have home court advantage, and I think in terms of the cohesiveness that they've been able to build, they also beat the Timberwolves earlier in this little stretch earlier this month in April. I think they'll be able to recreate that type of magic. Also, D'Angelo Russell is a former Timberwolf as well. I think his experience being in that locker room and knowing some of the weaknesses, he could be able to key in on some things and exploit some matchups there. So give me the Lakers to hold on to the 7th seed to set up a potential matchup with the Memphis Grizzlies. The 9-10 matchup is featuring the OKC Thunder taking on the New Orleans Pelicans. The Thunder have finally returned to postseason or late season basketball after a brief absence after the Russell Westbrook trade. It's been a tank job the last 2 seasons, and they were able to get the second overall pick. Now, Chet Holmgren obviously has been shelved for the regular season, but in his absence, they've been able to have a lot of other players step up. And with all these picks that they've been accruing over the last few years, it's been a great turnaround after obviously losing Kevin Durant and then later Russell Westbrook and Paul George. They look to be possibly coming back to the postseason slowly but surely. With guys like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, for example, he's been phenomenal this season. I mean, above 30 points a game, an all-star, taking that leap to being the lead dog in OKC. For the New Orleans Pelicans, I mean, early this season, we were talking about them being the number 1 seed in the Western Conference, but that has obviously taken a sour turn with the injury to Zion Williamson, as report after report are saying that he's going to return towards the end of the regular season. Now we are at the end of the regular season. We still haven't seen him play. If the Pelicans were to advance, there's still a chance that Zion could come back, but at this point I don't think he will be, and we're going to have to rely on what's currently constructed. And still, it's a very talented roster. I mean, the lead guy since coming back from injury has been Brandon Ingram. He's been an all-star. He's been there, done that, and he's been phenomenal in terms of not just scoring the ball, but rebounding and assisting, actually. He's been having, I think, a career high in terms of assists this year, and also this stretch where he had a couple of triple-doubles as well. I know he's been a capable passer, but this is just an extra dimension that I just never seen him been able to fully execute and have an offense run through him throughout an NBA game. So I think with him, I think that the entire cohesive unit that is the Pelicans, they were used to playing without Zion for most of the last 2 seasons, let's say. So give me the Pelicans to move on and beat the OKC Thunder in the 9-10 matchup, and then that's setting up a matchup between them and the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now, on Sunday, we saw Rudy Gobert get into a sideline confrontation with his teammate Kyle Anderson. Threw a punch at Kyle Anderson too, which is very, very suspect. I mean, it's funny because he mocked Draymond Green earlier this season for him throwing a punch at Jordan Poole. Draymond came right back and had the same exact tweet. Perfect for NBA Twitter. I thought that was a grade A moment for Draymond there. The Timberwolves are an interesting team. I think if Cat was there for a longer stretch of time, they wouldn't even have been in the play-in tournament, but this is where they stand based on how things have shaken out. I think it's a really tight matchup between them and the New Orleans Pelicans. I'm going to take the Minnesota Timberwolves in the slightest advantages just because they have home court. I'll take the Minnesota Timberwolves to move on and have the 8th seed and set up a matchup with the Denver Nuggets. I really like Kenneth Lofton's game back to his days in Summer League when I saw him just body Chet Holmgren. Obviously, bodying a guy like Chet Holmgren isn't really a flex, maybe because Chet Holmgren is just really all length, but not a lot of girth or strength, really. He's just really skinny. Kenneth Lofton is just the opposite of that. He's thick, he's strong, he's able to bully guys at the paint, kind of like a reincarnated version of Zebo or Zach Randolph for some people who may not be aware. He was a very talented forward for the Memphis Grizzlies back in the early 2010s, kind of in that age where the stretch four was just in its primitive days. But I think Kenneth Lofton, or Kenny Thick as I like to call him, would be a nice piece for the Memphis Grizzlies. He had a really nice game. Now you can talk about the impact maybe, but he had 42 points, 17 rebounds, and that's one hell of a stat line for a guy that was just averaging 3 points a game and played maybe about 20 games throughout the entire NBA regular season. His first career start, he took advantage of that. I don't know how many minutes he'll get in the postseason, but given the fact that Steven Adams is out and they also are without Brandon Clark, I think he's going to get some decent minutes. And yeah, he's an undersized power forward, but I really like his game, so I'm really excited to see what Kenny Thick can do in the postseason for the Memphis Grizzlies. So I'm going to preview the matchups that we already know on Sunday night, and at this moment, the two matchups we have in the Eastern Conference, we have the Sixers and the Nets. We saw this matchup back in 2019, a very different Nets team. This is before KD and Kyrie ever stepped foot, and kind of now, after KD and Kyrie have been traded, the Nets have been able to stay out of the play-in play-in tournament and remain afloat somewhat, and that's just mainly thanks to Mikal Bridges. I mean, him taking on this lead role with this team, especially now with him being shipped out of Phoenix, really nice move for him. I mean, he's been a guy that is averaging about 27 points a game for the Brooklyn Nets, being the go-to offensive scorer and very reliable too. He played 83 games this season, a very rare feat, obviously, that you can only do if you were traded to another team mid-season. But nonetheless, the Nets is definitely a nice story. I do think, though, their story does end against this Sixers team. This Sixers team has been very good, and it seems that Joel Embiid will be crowned MVP at the time of the end of the regular season. He's been having another phenomenal year. He locked up the scoring title the second year in a row. And the problem is that the Nets just don't have anybody to really bother Joel Embiid. Obviously, Joel is probably one of the more dominant centers. And yeah, there's a guy like Nikola Jokic or Steven Adams, at least on the defensive side of things. Anthony Davis, Karl Anthony Towns to maybe bother a guy like Joel Embiid, but Embiid's just on another level. And at least those other players that I mentioned at least have the size with the length and weight to contend with him. Joel Embiid is about 7'1", about 280 pounds. The biggest player on the Nets is probably Nick Claxton, and he is, yes, long, lengthy, but he gives up about 50 to 60 pounds, and that's a huge difference when you're banging in the paint, banging for rebounds, boxing out. So I expect, yeah, he can maybe get some blocks just because of his length, and he could alter a couple shots against Joel Embiid, but in terms of that size and weight difference, is just astronomical. I expect to see that Joel Embiid has a phenomenal series. We could even see a 40-point explosion maybe in the early games, especially in front of that raucous crowd in Philadelphia in the Wells Fargo Arena. So I'm going to take the Sixers in probably a gentleman's sweep, because if they're true title contenders that we want to see them be this postseason, they're going to have to dispatch a team like the Brooklyn Nets quite quickly. So I'm going to take the Philadelphia 76ers in 5 games. This is probably going to be the most intriguing matchup in the Eastern Conference for the first round. We're going to see the Cleveland Cavaliers take on the New York Knicks. Interesting storylines here, because the Knicks were really interested in a guy like Donovan Mitchell, but it turns out the Utah Jazz traded him to the Cleveland Cavaliers, and he's changed things astronomically over in Cleveland. Ever since his debut, they've been a team that was on the outside looking in. They were the 8th seed. They lost the play-in game to the Atlanta Hawks. They missed out on the postseason entirely. They had a lot to build on from that season where Darius Garland took that leadership role. Now, obviously, Donovan Mitchell is the best and the biggest superstar on that team, and he's the undisputed leader, but still, the complementary piece that Darius Garland supplies is excellent. They have Evan Mobley, also Jarrett Allen, the pretty good set of bigs there to impose or control the paint, and it's going to cause a lot of problems for a guy like Julius Randle, who's improved and certainly rebounded after that down year that he had in 2022. This year he's back to being an all-star and also has a ton of pressure taken off his hands and his shoulders thanks to the acquisition of Jalen Brunson. Brunson has been a breakout player this year. I thought he should have been an all-star this season, but missed the cut just barely, but still has been a great difference for the New York Knicks. And also just the emergence of guys like Emmanuel Quickley or Quentin Grimes, for example, excellent young pieces. And don't forget about the further development of RJ Barrett as well. Those 3 guys in particular have just been great in terms of just developing and then also taking on just key minutes, especially in crunch time situations. It's going to be big dividends in the postseason. I think they're going to be ready for this moment. They're going to push the Cleveland Cavaliers and give them a really good series. I think this could go 6-7 games, but given that the Cleveland Cavaliers, I think they're just a better team overall, especially been able to control the paint with that front court duo that I talked about with Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen. I think they're going to win this series in about 6 games, and I'll see that Donovan Mitchell probably has an iconic performance at MSG just to rub it in the Knicks fans' faces. In the Western Conference, we have the Clippers and Suns, and I mean, this is box office television. This series is gonna be go the full distance, 7 games. Both teams are poised to make deep runs in the postseason. It's just a shame that we're getting this so early, or maybe it's a treat that we're getting it so early. This series has more of a conference semifinal allure to it than just a first round matchup, but this is what we're gonna get, and I'm very excited for it. The Clippers in particular, I'm not sure if Paul George will be ready to suit up for this series, if at all, but still, without him, the Clippers have a ton of depth. We've been able to see the emergence of Norm Powell take on a continuous role, be a secondary scorer to complement Kawhi Leonard. Additionally, they've had Ivica Zubac been able to man the middle, get a ton of rebounds and key looks. Also, the midseason acquisition of Russell Westbrook has been pretty good for them. He hasn't been a good fit with the LA Lakers, but with the Clippers in particular, he's been able to do what he needs to do in limited minutes, be a guy that gets 16 points a game, 7 assists, 7 rebounds, quarterback the second unit, come off the bench, even be able to start a handful of games we've been able to see. But they also have guys like Bones Highland. Mason Plumlee has been great as a backup big, and we'll see what happens. But I mean, this team, like I said, has a ton of depth, and I think they'll be able to score in bunches too because of their shooting, with also guys like Eric Gordon. I think him in particular, after being forgotten in Houston, is going to be a kind of an X factor in this series, so look out for him. To the Phoenix Suns, I mean, they're obviously top heavy. With acquiring a guy like Kevin Durant, it's going to change the entire NBA landscape, which it did. In the 8 games he's played so far with the Phoenix Suns, they've been undefeated. Rightfully so. I mean, this kind of duo, or if you want to say foursome, Ayton, Chris Paul, Devin Booker, along with Kevin Durant, is a really tough team to beat. And yeah, they're top heavy, so I have some questions about their depth, because we've seen as soon as guy like Kevin Durant gets hurt, a lot of other guys are kind of put into that Kevin Durant role, and there's just not the same type of production. Obviously, big shoes to fill. But as long as Kevin Durant is healthy, I think the Phoenix Suns are certainly favorites to come out of the Western Conference this season. Him and Booker in particular have just been so easy to get along with. And then when you add in Chris Paul just to orchestrate the offense, DeAndre Ayton to man the middle and get boards, run pick and roll with Chris Paul, it's going to be a tough out for the Clippers because they're going to be stretched at every which way. Kawhi Leonard is going to have to step up. This is his first postseason since tearing his ACL 2 seasons ago. Expect him to guard Kevin Durant and at least try to be shadowing him as much as possible. He's load managed as he typically does, and now he's should be ready to go for the postseason. No restrictions asked, because this is where he has to make his mark and make a difference for this Clippers team. We've seen him in a couple postseasons. He's been very good, but he needs to deliver and get his team at least to the conference finals, because he wasn't part of that team that advanced to the conference finals 2 years ago because he got hurt. I'm sure Kawhi Leonard will show up in this series, but we'll see if he can match the type of production from Kevin Durant. Looking into this series, it's going to be really close. Like I said, it could go the full 7 games, but I think the talent is the difference here. So give me the Phoenix Suns to win this series in 7 games. The Kings and Warriors, it's certainly a very interesting matchup here. We got the Steve Kerr disciple in Mike Brown taking some Golden State concepts that he learned with his time in Golden State to the Sacramento Kings. The Kings have been one of the best offenses this season, if not the best. They're leading the league in points per game with almost 121 points a game. That's wild to me. Their stars are Domantas Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox, both all-stars, very well deserved. Sabonis in particular has been great since being acquired by the Sacramento Kings last season. And then De'Aaron Fox is finally getting the shine that he deserves after being kind of overlooked or shadowed by countless other guards in this very guard-heavy NBA. The Sacramento Kings have been forgotten. They've been laughed at for about 16 years, finally shutting down that entire postseason drought that they had since 2006. They have a chance now to really build on that, and obviously drew a very tough out with the defending champs in the Golden State Warriors. The playoffs are a different animal. We've seen it eat these younger teams alive. Memphis wasn't really ready for that moment against the Golden State Warriors last year. We've seen some other young teams, they've been able to have good regular seasons, but when it comes to the postseason, they just come up small. I do think that the issues on the road will continue to bother the Warriors. It's just been something that's been super weird this season. They do get back Andrew Wiggins. I'm just not sure about his conditioning and how he'll be able to reintegrate himself back into the offense because he's missed a great deal of time. I wish he was able to play at least 1 or 2 games after coming back and reporting to the Golden State Warriors after having those issues with his personal life. The Warriors, the problem is now they're 6 seeds, so they'll be facing many teams on the road and they won't have home court advantage for a majority of the postseason unless some massive upsets happen. As much as I do like the Kings, and trust me, I do, I think if they were to drop anybody else in the postseason, I think they would be fine. But the Warriors have this veteran leadership. They've been there, they've done that. So I think they'll be able to steal a game in Sacramento and hold serve and win this series in 6 games. It's been a very interesting weekend in the Premier League. We saw Chelsea name as their interim manager, Frank Lampard. He had a poor start to his second tenure with Chelsea. They lost to Wolves 1-0. Obviously, same thing for Chelsea. Lack of goals and decent defense except for a couple leaks giving way to a goal. The issue is the lack of strikers. I do like that Lampard just has the limited interim tag. I don't think he's the long-term solution to Chelsea at all, but it's going to be at this point just a crapshoot to see where exactly Chelsea lands at the end of the season. I think right now they just have a lot of holes to figure out, but at least they can look on to a new manager in the summer when more candidates come available and have a training season with a new manager, new mindset, and a fresh start, hopefully changing for the better. In the biggest matchup of the weekend, we saw Liverpool take on Arsenal. Early on, Arsenal had a very strong start, including a goal early on, and the second goal was thanks to Gabriel Jesus. He's coming back off an injury, his second goal from that injury from early on when he missed a significant amount of time. Very impressive stuff by him. Happy to see that he's back on the pitch, being effective for his club. Seemed that the route was on, but just before halftime, Mo Salah came in with a nice goal, cutting the deficit in half. They had another opportunity to tie just after halftime, and this was when Mo Salah just dragged the penalty kick wide of the net entirely. Not a good strike from him. He's been missing some penalty kicks this Premier League season. Just a weird year for him, but I think he'll respond next season. But he had some good strikes late in the match when after Firmino tied it to make it 2-2 with about 10 minutes left. Mo Salah had another chance with his left foot, deflected just wide of the net by the goalkeeper for Arsenal. Great stuff from him, because without that save, I think Liverpool would have won this match, possibly had a chance to get back into the top 4, put a huge dent into Arsenal's chances of winning the Premier League title this season. They still have a 6-point lead, but the problem is City has a game in hand, so if they win their next matchup and they're even on games, they'll go into the matchup at the end of this month down just 3. And if they beat Arsenal at the end of the month, that means they're even on points. And we all know in terms of goal differential, Man City has a huge goal differential amongst any team in the Premier League, mainly thanks to Erling Haaland. Plenty of football left to be played this season. I love a tight title race heading into the final leg of the season, so we'll see who comes out on top and who lifts the Premier League trophy at the end of this season. So that's it for this episode of Spectator Sports. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. This is 50 episodes in a year in making sports podcasts. I am loving how things have been growing, slowly expanding to many different platforms. So please give all those links in the description a look. Instagram, TikTok listed there for my Spotify listeners. If you could give this a 5-star rating, makes a massive difference for that platform. And on here on YouTube, if you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, makes a massive difference in the YouTube algorithm. But until then, stay safe. Have a happy Easter for those who celebrate, and I'll catch you on the next episode.